They told him the owner of the penthouse could not possibly look like him. The words landed in the marble lobby like a slap that nobody dared to acknowledge. Marcus Whitmore stopped walking, but did not turn around immediately. The glass doors behind him whispered shut, sealing the cool evening air outside, while the warmth of the lobby lights reflected off polished stone floors. For a moment, no one moved. A chandelier the size of a small car hung above the center of the room, its crystal pieces glowing softly like frozen drops of rain. Marcus slowly faced the man who had spoken. The building manager stood behind the front desk with his arms crossed and a thin expression that carried more judgment than curiosity. Marcus held a small leather travel bag in one hand, the kind a person carried after stepping off a long flight. His jacket was simple. His shoes were worn from walking through 3 airports in a single day. He looked tired, but his eyes were calm. "I live here," Marcus said quietly. The manager gave a short laugh that echoed against the high ceiling. Residents used the private entrance upstairs. Delivery staff used the service door outside. A couple standing near the elevators glanced over with mild interest before returning to their phones. A security guard near the wall straightened slightly, but said nothing. Marcus glanced across the lobby, his gaze traveling upward through the open atrium where 42 floors of glass balconies climbed toward the ceiling like a vertical city. Somewhere at the very top was the penthouse that carried his name on the property deed. Yet here he stood, treated like a stranger who had wandered in from the street. He drew a slow breath. It had been 12 hours since his flight left San Francisco, another 3 hours in traffic from the airport, and all he wanted now was a quiet room and a view of the Hudson River at night. Instead, he found himself standing in a lobby where the man behind the desk looked at him as if he had already decided the truth. The manager leaned forward slightly and tapped the counter with one finger. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the building." Marcus did not move. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you cannot miss. Marcus shifted the strap of his travel bag on his shoulder and looked again at the man behind the desk. There was no anger in his expression, only a quiet curiosity, as if he were watching a situation unfold that the other man had not yet understood. "May I ask how long you have worked here?" Marcus said calmly. The manager blinked, clearly not expecting the question. 3 years, he replied. Marcus nodded slowly. 3 years is a long time to stand in the lobby of a building without ever meeting the man who owns the penthouse upstairs. The manager stared at him for a second, then shook his head with a tight smile that carried more confidence than patience. "That is a creative story," he said. "But the residents of this building do not arrive carrying a single travel bag and asking questions at the front desk." Marcus looked past him toward the elevator bank where polished metal doors reflected the lights of the lobby. He imagined the quiet hallway above, the wide windows facing the river, the piano near the glass wall that he rarely had time to play. All of it was waiting just 42 floors above them. And yet, for the moment, the only thing between him and that elevator was the man behind the desk who had already decided who he was. Marcus Whitmore lifted his eyes back to the manager and spoke in the same calm voice. "Then perhaps tonight will be the first time you realize who actually lives here." Daniel Brooks stared at Marcus Whitmore for a long moment, as if the sentence he had just heard needed time to settle into something believable. The lobby lights reflected across the polished marble floor, and the silence that followed felt heavier than before. Daniel slowly leaned back against the front desk and folded his arms again. "I think you should leave now, sir," he said in a controlled voice that tried to sound patient but carried a thin edge of irritation. Marcus did not move. The leather strap of his travel bag rested across his shoulder, and his calm expression remained unchanged. Around him, the lobby continued its quiet rhythm. A young couple stepped out of the elevator, laughing softly about dinner plans. The doorman near the glass entrance shifted his weight, but kept watching from a distance. Marcus turned his head slightly and glanced toward the row of elevators again. The metal doors shone under warm lights, each reflecting a small, distorted version of the scene unfolding in the lobby. Somewhere above those doors waited the penthouse that overlooked the Hudson River, a place he had designed carefully years earlier when Skyline Tower was still a construction site and nothing but steel beams stood against the sky. Daniel tapped the front desk again, louder this time. Sir, I am serious. Residents in this building value privacy and security. If you do not leave, I will have to call security and ask them to escort you outside. Marcus finally set his travel bag gently on the floor beside him. The sound of leather touching marble echoed softly across the open space. His eyes met Daniel's again, and his voice remained steady. I understand security concerns, but you might want to check the resident records before making that decision. Daniel gave a short, dismissive smile. We check records when someone provides a name that actually belongs here. Marcus nodded once. Marcus Whitmore. The name seemed to drift across the lobby for a moment before fading into the quiet hum of the building air system. Daniel did not react. Instead, he tilted his head slightly and glanced toward the security desk near the hallway. The guard there had been watching more closely now. After a few seconds, Daniel spoke again. That name does not help your situation, he said. The owner of the Penthouse travels constantly and rarely appears without advance notice. Marcus allowed the faintest hint of amusement to touch his expression. That sounds inconvenient for someone who lives here. Daniel sighed and reached beneath the desk. His hand came back holding a small radio. Security, he said into it calmly. Could someone come to the main lobby for a moment? We may have a trespassing situation. The words caused several people in the lobby to look up again. The couple near the elevator fell silent. A woman seated on a sofa slowly lowered the tablet she had been reading. Marcus remained where he stood, his posture relaxed, his eyes steady. He had faced boardrooms full of skeptical investors before. Compared to those rooms, this lobby felt quiet and almost peaceful. Within less than a minute, the sound of firm footsteps approached from the hallway. Beside the security office, a tall man in a dark uniform stepped into view. His name badge read Ethan Cole, and his presence carried the calm confidence of someone used to solving problems quickly. Ethan glanced from Daniel to Marcus, and then down at the travel bag resting on the marble floor. What seems to be the issue, he asked. Daniel gestured lightly toward Marcus. This gentleman claims to live here, but refuses to leave when asked. Ethan studied Marcus carefully. There was no hostility in his gaze, only quiet assessment. Marcus lifted his identification wallet slowly and held it out. Ethan accepted it and opened the small leather fold. His eyes moved across the card inside, and his expression changed almost imperceptibly. For a moment, he said nothing. Daniel noticed the pause and frowned slightly. Something wrong, Ethan. Ethan closed the wallet slowly, but did not hand it back yet. Instead, he looked at Marcus again, then toward the elevators that rose toward the upper floors of Skyline Tower. Daniel shifted impatiently behind the desk, clearly expecting the situation to end quickly. Yet the silence in the lobby had deepened again, and something about Ethan Cole's expression suggested the story unfolding here might not be as simple as Daniel believed. The silence stretched across the lobby like a thin sheet of ice ready to crack at the smallest movement. Ethan Cole kept Marcus Whitmore's identification wallet in his hand a moment longer than necessary, his eyes scanning the name again as if confirming something he had just begun to suspect. The lights above reflected faintly across the smooth plastic of the card. Marcus stood calmly with both hands resting loosely at his sides. His travel bag remained on the marble floor beside him. Daniel Brooks shifted behind the front desk, clearly growing impatient. Well, Ethan, he said with a tight smile, you can escort him out now. I think we have wasted enough time. Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, he closed the wallet slowly and handed it back to Marcus. Thank you, sir, he said in a careful tone. Daniel frowned slightly at the word sir. Marcus accepted the wallet and slid it back into his jacket pocket. Around them, several people in the lobby had begun pretending not to watch, though their eyes occasionally drifted toward the front desk. The couple near the elevator now stood quietly, with their arms folded, curiosity replacing their earlier laughter. Daniel tapped the counter again with increasing impatience. Ethan, we cannot have strangers wandering into a residential building. The man claims to be Marcus Whitmore. You and I both know the actual owner of the penthouse rarely appears without notice. Ethan glanced briefly toward Daniel, but did not respond to the comment. Instead, he looked back at Marcus, studying him more carefully now. Something in Marcus's posture was different from what Ethan expected from a person attempting to sneak into a luxury building. There was no nervous shifting of weight, no hurried explanation, no anxious glance toward the exit. Marcus stood as if the lobby already belonged to him. The quiet confidence unsettled Ethan more than any argument would have. Marcus broke the silence with the same calm voice he had used before. Is there a problem with the identification card? Ethan hesitated for a moment before answering. The card appears valid, sir. Daniel's head snapped slightly in Ethan's direction. Appears valid, he repeated with disbelief. Of course it appears valid. Anyone with a printer can create a convincing card these days. Marcus listened without reacting. His gaze drifted briefly across the lobby again, past the tall glass entrance doors where the city lights outside flickered like distant stars. He had spent years building companies in rooms far less comfortable than this marble hall, and yet it was strange how quickly a place that belonged to him could begin to feel unfamiliar. Ethan finally spoke again, his voice quieter now. Sir, may I ask which floor you said you live on? Marcus answered without hesitation. The penthouse. 42. The number seemed to settle into the room with quiet weight. Daniel let out a small laugh, though it sounded forced now. That is convenient, he said. The most expensive residence in the entire tower. Marcus gave a slight nod. Yes, it is a very beautiful view at night. Daniel leaned forward across the desk, his patience thinning. Enough of this. Ethan, please escort this man outside. If he continues claiming ownership, we can call the police and allow them to handle it. The word police made the woman on the sofa glance up sharply. The couple near the elevator exchanged uneasy looks. Ethan remained still for another moment, his eyes now shifting briefly toward the security monitor mounted on the wall. Behind the desk, the screen displayed a list of current residents entering and leaving the building. A small cursor blinked beside a search field. Ethan stepped behind the desk and placed one hand on the keyboard. Daniel frowned. What are you doing? Just confirming something, Ethan replied. The keyboard clicked softly as he typed the name Marcus Whitmore into the system. For a moment the screen remained unchanged. Then the record appeared. Ethan felt his chest tighten slightly as the resident profile filled the monitor. Penthouse residence. Owner record verified. Primary property investor. The photograph attached to the file showed a man standing in front of the very same building years earlier during the ribbon-cutting ceremony. The man in the photograph was wearing a tailored suit and smiling beside the mayor of the city. Yet the face was unmistakable. Ethan slowly lifted his eyes from the screen and looked back toward Marcus Whitmore, standing quietly in the center of the lobby. Daniel Brooks leaned closer to the monitor behind the desk, clearly expecting Ethan Cole to confirm what he had already decided. The glow from the screen reflected across Daniel's face, while the lobby remained strangely quiet around them. Ethan did not speak at first. His eyes moved slowly across the information displayed on the screen. The resident profile was detailed, far more detailed than Daniel understood. Purchase records, ownership verification, property investment agreements connected to Skyline Tower itself. Ethan swallowed lightly. Daniel noticed the hesitation immediately. Well, Ethan, he said with growing impatience, you have confirmed it is not him, correct? Ethan remained still for another second before turning his head slightly toward Daniel. Actually, he began carefully, the system shows something different. Daniel frowned. What does that mean? Ethan hesitated again, glancing once more at the photograph on the screen. The image showed Marcus Whitmore several years earlier during the opening ceremony of the building. Standing beside the mayor of the city, Marcus had been smiling confidently while holding the silver ribbon scissors that marked the official launch of Skyline Tower. Ethan slowly looked back at the man standing in the middle of the lobby holding a simple travel bag. The resemblance was unmistakable. The same calm eyes, the same composed posture. The only difference was the clothing. Daniel leaned forward impatiently. Ethan, answer the question. Ethan finally spoke in a quiet voice that carried farther across the lobby than he expected. The system identifies Marcus Whitmore as the registered owner of the Penthouse residence on floor 42. The words settled into the air like a sudden drop in temperature. Daniel blinked once, clearly convinced he had misheard. "That is impossible," he said immediately. "The real Marcus Whitmore would not arrive here dressed like that." Marcus stood silently a few feet away, watching the exchange without interruption. Ethan kept his eyes on the screen. "The ownership record is verified through the city property registry," he continued carefully. "The Penthouse residence is also connected to the primary investment group that financed the construction of Skyline Tower." Daniel's expression hardened. "Anyone could place a name into a computer record," he replied. "The man is obviously pretending." Marcus finally spoke again, his voice calm but firm. "The building was finished 6 years ago. Construction began 2 years before that." For a moment, Daniel said nothing. Marcus continued, his tone steady, as if recalling something personal rather than proving a point. "The concrete for the upper structure was poured during a winter storm. The wind off the river delayed the crane lifts for almost 2 weeks. The architect wanted to redesign the top floor after that delay, but I decided the original plan was better." Daniel stared at him. Ethan slowly turned away from the monitor and faced Daniel fully now. The construction records he just described matched the development notes stored in the building archive. Daniel's confidence began to crack slightly, though he tried to hide it. "That information could be found online," he insisted. Marcus lifted his travel bag from the floor and rested it casually beside his leg. His eyes drifted once more toward the elevators rising through the center of the lobby. When the penthouse glass walls were installed, he continued quietly. "The workers asked if the windows should be tinted darker because of the afternoon sun. I told them to leave the glass clear. The view of the Hudson River at sunset was the entire reason I bought the top floor." Ethan felt a faint chill run down his back. Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but the words did not come easily this time. The people sitting in the lobby had stopped pretending not to listen. Even the doorman near the entrance was now watching openly. Marcus finally turned his attention back to Daniel. "Brooks, I understand you are responsible for security," Marcus said calmly. "That is an important job, but you may want to reconsider who you are asking to leave the building tonight." Daniel felt his throat tighten slightly. For the first time since Marcus had walked through the door, uncertainty crept into his expression. Ethan glanced once more at the glowing screen behind the desk, where the resident profile remained clearly visible. Name: Marcus Whitmore. Residence: Penthouse. Owner status confirmed. Ethan slowly exhaled and looked back toward the quiet man, standing in the center of the lobby, realizing that the situation Daniel believed he controlled had already begun to turn in a direction none of them expected. Daniel Brooks felt the quiet pressure of every eye in the lobby slowly turning toward him. The polished marble floor seemed colder beneath his feet, and the confident posture he had held only minutes earlier now felt strangely unstable. Ethan Cole remained beside the monitor, his gaze shifting between the screen and the man standing calmly in the center of the room. Marcus Whitmore did not raise his voice or move closer. He simply waited, his travel bag resting beside him, his expression steady as the quiet weight of the moment filled the lobby. Daniel cleared his throat and forced a small laugh that sounded thinner than before. "Computer systems make mistakes sometimes," he said quickly. "Ownership records can be complicated." Ethan turned his head toward him slowly. "The city property registry is connected directly to this system," he replied. "It does not generate random ownership records." Daniel did not answer immediately. The couple near the elevator had now completely stopped pretending not to listen. Even the woman on the sofa had placed her tablet down on the glass table beside her. Marcus finally spoke again, his voice calm but firm. "Daniel, before you call the police or ask security to remove someone from this building, there is usually one simple step that responsible managers take." Daniel looked at him sharply. "And what step is that?" Marcus tilted his head slightly toward the glowing monitor behind the desk. "You check the resident directory." Ethan slowly stepped aside from the keyboard so Daniel could see the screen clearly. The name Marcus Whitmore remained displayed beside the property profile of the penthouse residence on floor 42. Daniel stared at the screen longer this time. The photograph attached to the file showed Marcus standing in a dark suit during the ribbon-cutting ceremony several years earlier. Behind him, the skyline of the city had stretched across the river under a bright summer sky. Ethan spoke quietly. That photograph was taken on the day the building officially opened. Daniel leaned closer to the monitor, as if hoping a different answer would appear if he stared long enough. But the information did not change. Owner record verified. Penthouse residence. Primary development investor. Daniel slowly straightened and turned back toward Marcus Whitmore. The confidence that had filled his voice earlier was gone now, replaced by something uncertain. Marcus had not moved from the center of the lobby. His calm presence seemed even more noticeable now that the room had fallen completely silent. Daniel folded his arms again, though the gesture no longer carried the same authority. "If you really are Marcus Whitmore," he said cautiously, "then you would know that the penthouse elevator requires a personal access card." Marcus nodded once. "That is correct." Daniel gestured slightly toward the elevator bank. "Then where is that card?" Marcus reached calmly into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a thin black card with a silver edge. He held it up between two fingers where the lobby lights reflected faintly across its surface. The card carried a small engraved name. Marcus Whitmore. Ethan felt his shoulders tighten slightly as he recognized the access design immediately. Only one card like that existed in the entire building. Marcus slipped the card back into his jacket pocket without ceremony. Daniel said nothing for several seconds. His eyes drifted toward the elevators and then back toward Marcus again. The quiet certainty in Marcus Whitmore's posture made it increasingly difficult to maintain the argument that had seemed so obvious earlier. Marcus finally picked up his travel bag from the floor and stepped toward the elevator bank. The movement was unhurried, almost casual. He paused briefly beside the front desk and looked toward Daniel once more. "I understand that security matters in a building like this," Marcus said in the same calm voice. "But sometimes the easiest way to recognize the person who belongs here is simply to look closely at the one standing in front of you." Daniel felt his face grow warmer under the bright lobby lights. Marcus continued walking toward the elevators, the quiet sound of his footsteps echoing softly across the marble floor. Ethan watched him go, the reality of the situation settling more clearly with each step Marcus took. For the first time since Marcus Whitmore had entered the lobby, Daniel Brooks realized the man he had been trying to remove from the building might truly be the person who owned the entire top floor above them. Marcus Whitmore reached the row of elevators and stopped in front of the center door, where a small glass panel waited beside the polished metal frame. The quiet lobby lights reflected across the chrome surface of the elevator doors while the faint hum of the building systems filled the silence behind him. He set his travel bag down for a moment and reached calmly into his jacket pocket. The thin black access card appeared again between his fingers. Behind him, Daniel Brooks and Ethan Cole watched without speaking. The people sitting around the lobby had now abandoned any attempt to hide their curiosity. The couple near the elevator leaned slightly closer, and even the doorman near the entrance had stepped forward a few feet. Marcus lifted the card and passed it slowly across the glass panel. A soft electronic tone answered immediately. The panel glowed green. The elevator doors unlocked with a quiet mechanical click that echoed through the marble hall. Ethan felt a slow breath leave his chest as the confirmation removed the last doubt in his mind. Daniel, however, stood frozen behind the desk. The sound of the lock releasing seemed louder than it should have been, like a door opening inside his own certainty. Marcus picked up his travel bag again, but did not step into the elevator yet. Instead, he turned slightly and looked back across the lobby toward the front desk. The calm expression on his face had not changed since the moment he walked through the entrance doors. Daniel Brooks met his gaze for a second and then looked away toward the monitor beside Ethan. The resident profile remained visible on the screen, glowing quietly under the desk lamp. Ethan finally spoke in a low voice that carried clearly across the room. The access card is authentic, Daniel. Only the penthouse owner has that clearance level. Daniel swallowed and rubbed the side of his neck slowly. The confident authority he had shown earlier now seemed to dissolve under the weight of the simple fact standing in front of him. Marcus Whitmore walked back a few steps from the elevator and returned toward the front desk with the same unhurried pace he had shown since the beginning. The sound of his shoes crossing the marble floor was soft but steady. Daniel straightened slightly as Marcus approached, unsure whether he should speak or remain silent. Marcus stopped a few feet from the desk and rested his travel bag lightly beside him again. "I believe your job here is to keep the residents safe," Marcus said calmly. "That responsibility matters." Daniel nodded once, though the motion felt stiff. "Yes, sir." Marcus studied his face quietly for a moment. The lobby lights reflected faintly across the polished counter between them. A few seconds passed before Marcus continued speaking. "But security is not only about stopping the wrong people from entering," he said. "It is also about recognizing the ones who belong here." Daniel felt the words settle into the room like a quiet judgment. Ethan remained silent beside the monitor, allowing the moment to unfold without interruption. Marcus reached once more into his jacket and placed the black access card on the counter between them. The engraved letters of his name caught the light. Daniel looked down at it slowly. Marcus Whitmore, the same name that now glowed on the monitor behind him. Marcus lifted his eyes again. "I have not visited this building in several months," he said. "Travel keeps me away more often than I would like. But this place still carries my name on the top floor." Daniel exhaled quietly. The reality he had refused to accept only minutes earlier was now impossible to deny. "I understand, sir," he said slowly. Marcus nodded once and picked up the card again. For a brief moment the tension that had filled the lobby seemed to ease. Yet Marcus did not return to the elevator immediately. Instead, he glanced once more toward the large glass entrance doors where the lights of the city shimmered outside against the night sky. The building that had once been only an idea on an architect's blueprint now stood fully alive around them. And the man Daniel had tried to remove from the lobby only minutes earlier was the very person who had helped bring it into existence. The lobby remained quiet after Marcus Whitmore finished speaking. Yet the silence no longer carried tension alone. It carried awareness, the kind that slowly spreads through a room when everyone realizes something important has just been revealed. Marcus slipped the black access card back into his jacket pocket and rested one hand lightly on the handle of his travel bag. The soft glow from the chandelier above reflected across the polished marble floor, turning the entire lobby into a mirror of quiet light. Daniel Brooks stood behind the desk with his shoulders stiff, his earlier certainty now replaced by an uncomfortable stillness. Ethan Cole remained beside the monitor, watching both men carefully but saying nothing. For a few seconds nobody moved. Then Marcus reached into his bag and pulled out a folded document envelope. The paper inside had softened at the edges from travel. He placed the envelope gently on the counter between himself and Daniel. When Skyline Tower was only a steel frame above the river, Marcus said calmly, the city planning office required every investor to sign a structural liability agreement. Daniel looked down at the envelope but did not touch it. Marcus opened the fold and slid the top page forward. The paper carried an official seal from the City Development Board. Ethan leaned slightly closer, recognizing the stamp immediately. That document was issued only to primary project investors. Marcus tapped the paper lightly with one finger. My signature is on the second page. Daniel hesitated before finally lifting the paper. His eyes moved across the printed text slowly. Development Partner Record. Skyline Tower Construction Authority. Primary Investment Contributor. Marcus Whitmore. The signature beneath the printed name matched the one attached to the resident profile on the monitor behind him. Daniel felt his stomach tighten. Around the lobby, the quiet observers watched the scene unfold with growing interest. The couple near the elevator whispered softly to each other. The woman who had been sitting on the sofa now stood beside the glass table, her tablet forgotten. Marcus folded the envelope, closed again, and slipped the document back into his bag without urgency. He had not raised his voice once since entering the building. Yet the calm certainty in his words had gradually replaced the earlier doubt that filled the room. Ethan finally spoke again in a steady voice. Daniel, the property investment records match the resident system. The development archive confirms it as well. Daniel rubbed his temples slowly, trying to process the mistake that now stood clearly in front of him. I was only following the security policy, he said quietly. Marcus nodded once. And that policy exists for a reason. His voice remained calm, almost understanding. But assumptions can turn a good policy into the wrong decision. Daniel lowered his eyes for a moment. The marble counter suddenly felt heavier beneath his hands. Marcus glanced once more toward the elevators. The doors waited silently where he had unlocked them earlier, their reflective surfaces showing faint images of the people standing behind him. Yet Marcus did not walk away yet. Instead, he rested both hands lightly on the counter and looked at Daniel with a steady expression. Let me ask you something, Marcus said. Daniel lifted his head again slowly. If someone walks into this lobby wearing expensive clothes, carrying a designer suitcase, and speaking confidently about owning a home here, would you question them as strongly as you question me tonight? Daniel did not answer immediately. The question hung in the air like a quiet mirror reflecting the truth back at him. Marcus continued gently. Security protects a building, but fairness protects the people inside it. Ethan glanced down at the floor for a moment, recognizing the quiet lesson in Marcus Whitmore's words. Daniel inhaled slowly. The certainty he had relied on earlier now seemed small compared to the calm dignity standing across the desk from him. I understand what you are saying, sir, Daniel replied carefully. Marcus nodded once more. Good. Then, the building is already becoming a better place tonight. Marcus lifted his travel bag again and turned toward the elevator bank. This time the room watched him differently, not as a stranger trying to enter the building, but as the man who had quietly proven he belonged there all along. Marcus Whitmore walked toward the elevator with the quiet confidence of a man who had nothing left to prove, yet the atmosphere in the lobby had changed so completely that even the sound of his footsteps carried a different meaning now. The polished marble floor reflected his figure as he approached the elevator doors again, his travel bag resting lightly in his hand. Behind him, the lobby remained still, but the stillness now held a quiet realization rather than tension. Daniel Brooks stood behind the front desk with both hands resting. On the counter, his shoulders no longer rigid, but heavy with the weight of the mistake he had made. Ethan Cole remained beside the monitor, watching Marcus carefully, his expression thoughtful. Marcus reached the elevator and paused for a moment, looking at the glass panel beside the door. The green light from the earlier access scan still glowed faintly before fading back to its neutral color. He could step inside and leave the lobby behind, yet something in the quiet room made him turn slightly instead. He glanced back toward the front desk where Daniel stood. Daniel noticed the movement immediately and straightened a little, unsure whether Marcus intended to speak again. Marcus walked a few steps back toward the desk, his pace calm and measured. The couple near the elevator watched with quiet curiosity, while the woman near the sofa slowly folded her arms as if she understood the moment carried more meaning than a simple misunderstanding. Marcus stopped a few feet from the counter again and rested his travel bag beside him. Daniel spoke first this time, his voice lower than before. Sir, I owe you an apology. The words sounded difficult for him to say, but they carried sincerity. Marcus regarded him for a moment before answering. You were doing the job you believed was right, he said calmly. Daniel shook his head slightly. I made assumptions before checking the facts. That is not security. That is carelessness. Ethan glanced toward Daniel with quiet approval. The honesty in his voice changed the tone of the room again. Marcus nodded slowly. The truth is that buildings like this are built on trust long before they are built on concrete. Daniel listened carefully, the lesson settling deeper than any argument could have. Marcus continued in the same calm voice. The steel frame holds the floors together, but the people inside determine what kind of place it becomes. Daniel looked down at the polished counter for a moment, absorbing the words. The mistake he had made only minutes earlier now felt larger than a simple misunderstanding. Marcus Whitmore could have reacted with anger, could have demanded authority or consequences. Instead, he had answered every accusation with patience. That quiet dignity made the lesson impossible to ignore. Ethan finally stepped forward slightly. "Sir, if you would like, I can escort you to the penthouse level." Marcus smiled faintly at the offer. "Thank you, but I know the way." The gentle humor in his tone eased the tension in the lobby. Even Daniel allowed a small breath of relief to escape him. Marcus picked up his travel bag once more and turned toward the elevator again. This time no one questioned his place there. As he reached the door, he lifted the access card and passed it across the panel once more. The green light appeared instantly, and the elevator doors slid open with a quiet mechanical whisper. Marcus stepped inside and turned back toward the lobby before the doors closed. Daniel and Ethan both stood watching. The other residents remained silent but attentive. Marcus rested one hand lightly on the elevator railing and spoke one final sentence before the doors began to close. A building is only as strong as the respect people show each other inside it. The elevator doors slid together slowly, leaving the lobby in a thoughtful silence. Daniel Brooks remained behind the desk staring at the empty space where Marcus Whitmore had stood only moments earlier, realizing that the man he had tried to remove from the building had instead just given him the most important lesson he had learned since becoming the manager of Skyline Tower. The elevator rose smoothly through the center of Skyline Tower, its quiet mechanical hum echoing softly within the polished metal walls. Marcus Whitmore stood alone inside, one hand resting lightly on the railing while the city lights of New York shimmered through the glass panels of the rising shaft. Floor numbers glowed one after another above the door. The movement upward felt steady and calm, yet Marcus found himself thinking about the moment that had just unfolded downstairs. The reflection of his own face looked back at him from the steel surface of the elevator door. Tired from travel, dressed simply, carrying the same worn leather bag he had used for years. Nothing about his appearance tonight suggested the story behind the building rising around him. That was something Marcus had learned a long time ago. Success did not always arrive wearing a tailored suit. Sometimes it arrived carrying a small travel bag and walking quietly through the front door. When the elevator reached the top level, it slowed gently before the doors opened to the quiet private hallway of the penthouse floor. Soft lighting illuminated the polished wood walls and the long glass window that overlooked the Hudson River. Marcus stepped out and paused for a moment, breathing in the familiar stillness. The hallway smelled faintly of cedar and fresh air drifting in from the ventilation system. At the far end of the corridor stood the large double doors of the penthouse residence. Marcus walked toward them slowly. The quiet sound of his footsteps echoed softly across the floor. As he reached the door, he placed the black access card against the sensor beside the frame. The lock responded instantly with a soft click. The doors opened inward to reveal the wide living space beyond. The penthouse stretched across the entire top level of the tower. Floor-to-ceiling glass windows revealed the night skyline of the city and the dark ribbon of the Hudson River flowing beneath the lights of the bridges. Marcus stepped inside and placed his travel bag on the long oak table near the entrance. The room felt calm and untouched, exactly as he had left it months earlier. A piano stood near the glass wall where the sunset usually painted the water with orange light. A long leather sofa faced the city view. Marcus walked slowly toward the window and rested his hands lightly on the glass railing that bordered the room. From this height, the city looked peaceful, almost quiet despite the endless life moving through its streets. Yet his thoughts drifted back to the lobby below, where Daniel Brooks still stood behind the desk, likely replaying the entire moment again and again. Marcus did not feel anger toward the man. He understood how quickly people could reach conclusions when they believed they already knew what a successful person should look like. Still, the moment carried a lesson that mattered. The strength of a building was not only in its steel and concrete, but also in the fairness shown to every person who walked through its doors. Marcus turned away from the window and walked across the living room, switching on a small lamp beside the sofa. Warm light spread across the quiet space. Down in the lobby, Daniel Brooks remained behind the desk long after the elevator had disappeared from view. Ethan Cole stood beside him with his arms folded, watching the monitor quietly. Daniel finally spoke after several long seconds of silence. "I almost had the police remove the man who built this place." Ethan nodded slowly. "But you did not." Daniel rubbed his forehead thoughtfully. "No," he said quietly, "and I will remember that moment every time someone walks through those doors from now on." The lobby remained calm again, yet the meaning of what had happened there would linger far longer than the quiet night surrounding Skyline Tower. Morning arrived slowly over the Hudson River, the pale light of dawn spreading across the glass walls of the penthouse, while the city below began to stir awake. Marcus Whitmore stood near the window, holding a cup of black coffee, watching the early boats move across the water like quiet shadows. The events of the previous night had not left his thoughts, though he carried them without bitterness. From this height, the streets of Manhattan looked peaceful, the rush of traffic still hours away from its usual intensity. The skyline reflected softly across the river, while sunlight touched the steel towers one by one. Marcus set the cup down on the kitchen counter and walked across the living room toward the long oak table where his travel bag rested. He opened it and removed a thin folder containing documents he had planned to review that morning. Among them was a property development report connected to several buildings across the city, including Skyline Tower itself. Marcus paused for a moment while looking at the familiar name printed across the top of the report. It had been years since he spent time inside the daily operations of the building. He had trusted the management team to maintain the place he helped bring into existence. Yet the moment in the lobby had revealed something important. Systems could be well designed, but the character of the people running them mattered even more. Down in the lobby, Daniel Brooks arrived earlier than usual that morning. The memory of the previous night had followed him home and returned with him before sunrise. The building was quiet when he stepped behind the front desk, the marble floor reflecting the first soft light entering through the tall glass entrance doors. Ethan Cole was already there finishing his overnight shift report. Daniel nodded toward him. "I did not sleep much last night," Daniel admitted quietly. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair. "I imagine you replayed the entire moment again." Daniel gave a small, tired smile. "More than once." Ethan closed the report folder and placed it on the desk. "The important thing is what you do with it now." Daniel looked toward the elevator bank where Marcus Whitmore had disappeared only hours earlier. "That man built this building, and I almost had him escorted out like a trespasser," Daniel said. Ethan nodded slowly. "But he chose not to humiliate you in return." Daniel folded his arms and stared across the quiet lobby. "That is what stayed with me the most," he replied. He had every right to react with anger. Instead, he gave me a lesson. The doors at the front entrance opened quietly as a resident walked in carrying a briefcase. Daniel straightened immediately and greeted the man with calm professionalism. Yet something about his posture had changed. He observed the resident carefully, but without judgment. The man nodded politely and walked toward the elevator without incident. Ethan noticed the difference right away. Daniel turned slightly toward him after the resident left. "From now on, I check the facts before I check my assumptions," Daniel said. Ethan allowed a faint smile. "That sounds like the kind of policy every building manager should have." Meanwhile, far above them, Marcus Whitmore finished reviewing the development report and placed the folder back on the table. He walked toward the window once more, watching the city come fully alive under the rising sun. The lesson that had unfolded in the lobby the night before had already begun to ripple through the building below, changing something quiet but important inside Skyline Tower. Late morning sunlight filled the penthouse with a warm glow that stretched across the oak floors and the glass walls overlooking the Hudson River. Marcus Whitmore sat at the long table near the window with a tablet resting in front of him, quietly reviewing several property updates connected to his development company. The city outside had fully awakened now. Traffic moved steadily across the bridges, and the distant sound of boats traveling along the river drifted faintly upward. Yet Marcus was only half focused on the documents. His thoughts returned again to the lobby the night before and the expression on Daniel Brooks' face when the truth became impossible to ignore. Marcus did not feel satisfaction about the moment. Instead, he felt something closer to reflection. Moments like that had followed him many times throughout his life. People often expected wealth to look a certain way. They expected authority to dress a certain way. When those expectations were challenged, the reaction was often the same. Doubt first, judgment second, understanding much later. Marcus closed the tablet and leaned back in the chair. Across the room, the piano stood quietly beside the window, its polished surface reflecting the city skyline. He walked over and touched the edge of the instrument lightly, remembering the day the Penthouse was finished years earlier. The developers had asked him what kind of furniture he wanted placed inside the space. Marcus had told them the same thing he believed about buildings themselves. Keep it simple. Let the view do the talking. Down in the lobby, Daniel Brooks stood behind the desk while the morning activity of Skyline Tower moved around him. Residents entered and left for work, greeting him with polite nods. Delivery staff checked in at the service entrance. Everything looked the same as it had every other morning. Yet Daniel felt different inside the familiar routine. Each person who walked through the doors now received a moment of careful attention from him. Not suspicion, just attention. Ethan Cole finished his overnight shift report and placed the folder on the desk before preparing to leave for the day. Daniel glanced toward him. I keep thinking about what he said last night, Daniel admitted quietly. Ethan adjusted his jacket and waited for him to continue. Daniel rested his hands on the counter. He said that buildings are not only built with steel and concrete. They are built with trust. Ethan nodded slowly. That is something many people forget when they sit behind a desk too long. Daniel watched another resident cross the lobby toward the elevator bank. I almost damaged that trust before the building owner even reached his own home. Ethan placed a hand briefly on the desk. But you listen when the truth appeared. That matters more than the mistake. Daniel exhaled quietly and nodded. I will remember that. A few moments later, the elevator doors opened and a cleaning supervisor stepped out with a maintenance clipboard. Daniel greeted her politely and helped direct her toward a service hallway. The small exchange seemed ordinary, yet Ethan noticed how calmly Daniel spoke with her and how carefully he listened when she asked a question about the service elevator schedule. As Ethan walked toward the exit, he glanced back once more. Daniel Brooks looked like the same building manager he had worked beside for years, yet the change in his attitude was clear. The lesson from a night before had settled deeply. High above them, Marcus Whitmore returned to the glass window and looked down across the city. Somewhere far below was the lobby where a quiet misunderstanding had turned into something more meaningful. The building stood tall against the skyline, its steel frame strong and steady. Yet Marcus knew that the real strength of Skyline Tower would always come from the people inside it and the respect they chose to show each other every day. The afternoon sun moved slowly across the glass walls of the penthouse, casting long reflections across the quiet living room while the city outside continued its restless rhythm. Marcus Whitmore stood near the window again, watching the river as clouds drifted above the skyline. The events of the previous night had already begun to fade into the steady pace of another day, yet the meaning of that moment remained clear in his mind. He understood something that many people who lived in buildings like Skyline Tower often forgot. Wealth could build impressive walls and glass towers, but character was what determined the atmosphere inside them. Marcus walked across the room and placed his tablet on the table before picking up his coat. He planned to leave the penthouse for a short meeting later that afternoon. Before stepping out, he paused for a moment beside the piano, pressing a single soft note that echoed quietly through the open space. The sound lingered in the air before fading into silence. Meanwhile, far below in the lobby, Daniel Brooks stood behind the desk as the afternoon traffic of residents and visitors passed through the entrance doors. The rhythm of the building had returned to normal. Yet Daniel noticed something about his own behavior had changed since the previous night. He looked at each person who entered the lobby with a calm attentiveness that had not been there before. Not suspicion, just attention. A delivery driver entered carrying a small stack of packages, and Daniel stepped forward to help guide him toward the service hallway. A few minutes later, a young couple arrived asking about guest parking, and Daniel patiently explained the building policy. None of these moments were dramatic. They were ordinary pieces of daily life inside Skyline Tower. Yet Ethan Cole noticed the difference when he returned briefly to the lobby that afternoon to drop off an updated security report. Daniel looked up as Ethan approached the desk. "I've been thinking about something Marcus Whitmore said last night," Daniel admitted quietly. Ethan leaned lightly against the counter. "What part stayed with you the most?" Daniel glanced across the lobby where sunlight reflected across the marble floor. He said that the real strength of a building comes from the respect people show each other inside it. Ethan nodded slowly. "That sounds like a lesson worth remembering." Daniel gave a small, thoughtful smile. "It already changed the way I see this place." Just then the elevator doors opened and a maintenance technician stepped out holding a clipboard. Daniel greeted him by name and helped him confirm the floor assignment for the day. Ethan watched the exchange and recognized the quiet shift in Daniel's attitude. The building manager who had once relied only on rules now understood something deeper about responsibility. Above them in the penthouse, Marcus Whitmore stepped into the private elevator and allowed the doors to close quietly behind him. The elevator descended smoothly toward the lobby where the city waited outside the glass entrance doors. When the elevator reached the ground level, Marcus stepped out and crossed the marble floor toward the front desk. Daniel immediately straightened when he saw him approach. This time, there was no hesitation in his voice. "Good afternoon, Mr. Whitmore." Marcus nodded politely. "Good afternoon, Daniel." The brief exchange carried none of the tension from the night before. Instead, it held something much simpler: mutual respect. Marcus continued walking toward the exit doors where the afternoon sunlight poured through the glass. As he stepped outside into the busy streets of Manhattan, he did not look back at the tower behind him. Yet inside Skyline Tower, the lesson he had delivered without anger or accusation had already begun to reshape the atmosphere of the building, one quiet interaction at a time. The evening returned quietly to Skyline Tower as the sun lowered behind the western skyline and the lights of Manhattan slowly awakened one by one across the horizon. The glass walls of the penthouse reflected the fading gold of sunset, while the Hudson River below turned dark and calm beneath the bridges. Marcus Whitmore stood near the window once again, the same place where he often ended his days when the city finally slowed enough for him to breathe. His coat rested across the back of a chair, and the soft glow of the living room lamp filled the wide, open space behind him. The events that had unfolded since the night before had already settled into memory, yet the meaning of that moment continued to ripple quietly through the building below. Down in the lobby, Daniel Brooks finished his shift as the evening concierge prepared to take over the desk. The marble floor reflected the warm lights of the chandelier, while residents returned home from work, greeting the staff with polite nods and quiet conversations. The building looked the same as it had every other evening. Yet something about the atmosphere felt calmer, more attentive. Daniel watched each person enter with the steady patience he had begun practicing since the night Marcus Whitmore walked through the doors carrying nothing but a small travel bag. When a delivery driver stepped inside with several packages, Daniel greeted him respectfully and guided him toward the service desk with clear instructions. A few minutes later, an elderly resident arrived carrying groceries, and Daniel walked around the desk to help carry the bags to the elevator. None of these actions were dramatic, yet the change in his attitude was obvious to anyone who paid attention. Ethan Cole stopped by the lobby briefly before heading home for the night. He leaned lightly against the desk and observed the steady flow of people passing through the entrance. "You look different behind that desk today," Ethan said quietly. Daniel smiled faintly. "I think I finally understand what it means to manage a place like this." Ethan raised an eyebrow slightly. "And what does it mean?" Daniel glanced across the lobby toward the elevator doors where Marcus Whitmore had stood the night before. "It means remembering that the people who walk through those doors are more important than the rules we place in front of them." Ethan nodded once with quiet approval. "That sounds like a building worth living in." Later that evening, the private elevator opened once more on the penthouse level. Marcus Whitmore stepped inside his home after returning from a long meeting across the city. He placed his coat on the chair and walked toward the glass wall overlooking the river. The skyline shimmered with thousands of lights, each one representing a life unfolding somewhere within the city below. Marcus rested his hands lightly on the railing and looked down toward the tower entrance far beneath him. He knew Daniel Brooks was likely still standing behind the front desk doing the job he believed in, only now with a deeper understanding of the responsibility that position carried. Marcus allowed himself a quiet smile. Buildings like Skyline Tower would always rise high above the streets because of steel and concrete. But the true height of a place would always be measured by something else. Respect, understanding, and the quiet dignity shown to every person who walked through the door. The lights of the city reflected softly across the glass as Marcus Whitmore stood in silence, knowing that one moment of patience had changed more than a simple misunderstanding. It had changed the way an entire building would treat the people inside it for years to come.